Hi, everyone. I'm Dr. Jennifer Roback Morse, founder and president of the Ruth Institute. Today's episode of the Dr. J Show features a very special visit by Miss Christine Niles, who is an on-air personality for Church Militant. You probably know her best as a person who does investigative reporting on clergy sex abuse cases. She is hard-hitting and very, very careful and meticulous. So I'm delighted to welcome Christine Niles to the Dr. J Show. Christine, thanks for joining us.
It's an honor to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
Oh, well, I think we're going to have a blast talking to each other about these topics. So let's get started by first tell our followers a little bit about yourself and how you got involved in doing TV work. What's your professional background that led you to this line of work?
Sure. Well, a lot of people are always surprised when I say that I actually had no professional TV background before I came to Church Militant. They just assumed that I'd been doing it for years. And actually, I'd been doing nothing of the sort, the exact opposite. And I'm a perfect example of how God writes straight with crooked lines. And he uses his most unexpected instruments to carry out his will. Because if anyone had told me, more than a decade ago that I would be doing what I'm doing today, I would have laughed in their faces. I would have said, that's impossible. I could never do anything like that. I was terrified of being on camera. Before I came to Church Militant, I ran an audio-only podcast called Forward Boldly, where I interviewed a bunch of different Catholic leaders. And I was terrified doing that. And you didn't even see my face. All you heard was my voice. I was terrified doing that. My heart would be pounding every time. So, I've always been, people don't believe me when I say this, but I grew up painfully shy. I'm an introvert. I don't like getting in front of crowds and speaking. I'm not that sort of person. But through a very circuitous route, I ended up at Church Militant. My background is actually more academic. I was born in Vietnam, Saigon, Vietnam. In 1974, the communists come in, take over Saigon in April 15th, 1975. A year after that, my family essentially leaves Vietnam because the communists took everything that our family had. We went to France for a while because we were actually French citizens. My French citizenship came from my grandfather through my mother. My grandfather was a colonel in the French army stationed in, at the time, what was known as Indochina. So his citizenship passed down to us. That turned out to be a tremendous grace because we didn't have to go through the fate of the refugees, the boat people, which were actually many of my relatives. We sponsored a number of them to come to the United States. But so we were able to get on a plane, go to France, live there for a few years. My father went from being, a respected civil engineer in Vietnam, honorary chairman of a bank, to driving taxis in the streets of France just to support his family. And he eventually made the decision, a very difficult and courageous decision, to come to America with his wife and 3 very young children and almost no English to speak of. His accent was extremely heavy, so almost nobody understood him. He basically had to kind of learn the ropes of the civil engineering business in the United States. But thanks be to God, through hard work, through God's grace, he was able to raise 3 of his children, put us through college, and now we all have our own careers. Now, I did study.
So how old were you? How old were you when Saigon fell?
I was 2.
You were 2 years old. Okay, so listen, I remember.
No, I'm sorry, I was 1. I was 2 when we left.
Yeah. Okay. I remember this period very well because during that period of time, I was a student at Ohio State University, and there were several Vietnamese students in our economics program. And I remember them going back and getting out and, just the trauma of trying to get out of Vietnam during that period of time. So this is quite remarkable. So anyway, there you are in the United States with your family. And a typical Vietnamese refugee success story is what it sounds like to me.
Yeah. And I ended up going, because we grew up in Florida, South Florida. So I ended up going to the University of Florida in Gainesville. I got a bachelor's degree in philosophy because I had a deep love of philosophy, but also theology. I went on to get a Master of Studies degree at Oxford in theology. I was actually accepted into what would be considered, the equivalent of the PhD program in Oxford to study philosophical theology under Dr. Richard Swinburne, who was, a very well-respected, at the time, he was a Protestant theologian. I believe since then he's converted to Catholicism, but I didn't have money. Oxford's very expensive. I didn't have the money. I came back to the United States and it said I decided to go to law school. So I went to Notre Dame Law School. Believe it or not, that's where I came back to the faith. Thanks be to God. And so I got a law degree. I'm licensed to practice law, but I'm not practicing now. I'm actually devoting myself to full-time journalism. But it's funny how I actually ended up at Church Militant because I used to run a blog, a Catholic blog called Laudem Gloriae, which means praise of glory. And that was the favorite phrase of Saint Elizabeth of the Trinity, a wonderful discalced Carmelite nun who died a very saintly death at the age of 26 from tuberculosis. And I had a great devotion to her. And so I would blog about various Catholic things, and my email was on that blog. So someone from Church Militant, at the time was called Real Catholic TV. We've changed our name since then, but someone from there apparently grabbed my email address, and I was included in the email list for the Vortex, which just started in 2008. And so I was beginning to get the Vortex in my inbox. I had no idea who this person was. I wasn't really interested, honestly. But I decided, okay, let me click on this and see what the Vortex is all about. So I click on it, and this is my honest thoughts. My first thought was, okay, really dorky intro music. And then at the time he was pointing out Obama. He was warning people about Obama at the time. It's 2008, right? And it's his presidential election, all of that. And so to me, I was not impressed. I just thought, it's just another, conservative talking head, political pundit saying obvious things that we already know. And I clicked off after 30 seconds. But I kept getting these in my inbox. And it actually was ticking me off. I was getting ticked off because I was like, why am I getting spammed with these every day when I didn't sign up for this? So I actually wrote to Church Militant and I said, get me off your list now. I didn't sign up for this. I don't want this. Stop spamming my inbox. And so they stopped. And that was my first exposure to the Vortex. And it's funny because I didn't think about Voris or any of that for 3 years. But then I started seeing his name pop up on the internet as very controversial. And he was being attacked here and attacked there and all over the place. I'm like, okay, I'm seeing his name. People are attacking him. What are they attacking about? And I remember reading one of the articles written against him, and they were saying, oh, he says these things in this video and blah, blah, blah. So I watched the video. It's a Vortex. And I agreed with every word that he said. And I said, what's the big, he's speaking the truth. And so I kind of started defending him from that. So, and the rest is kind of history. After that, I started getting, writing to the staff. So they kind of knew me. And then Michael learned about my academic background, and he decided to invite me up to visit the studio. And then after that 3-day visit, he offered me a full-time position. What's really funny, though, is that when he offered me the position, my understanding was it would be purely research and writing, because that's what I'm most comfortable doing. That's my background. I like sitting at a computer, doing the research, doing the writing. I'm a writer by heart, by nature. And I ended up doing TV kind of unexpectedly because the person who was heading Headlines News went off to get married, and then another person went off to join a monastery. And then the fill-in. What
terrible things for people to be abandoning Michael for a monastic life. What the heck?
I know. And then the fill-in couldn't do it because he was going to travel to London for 2 weeks. And so Michael walks up to me one day, and I had just gotten on board. Like it would just been like 2 months, I think, since I'd started working at Church Militant. He walks up to me that morning. He's like, "You're doing headlines today." And I'm just like, what? I can't. And I was finding out all sorts of excuses why I shouldn't do it. For instance, the night before, when my youngest was still in diapers, like pull-up diapers, the night before, I was pulling up her diapers from behind, and she went back like this really hard with her head and smacked me in the chin so hard that I actually saw stars. I mean, it was that hard. And the next morning I woke up with a huge purple bruise right here. I mean, it was massive purple bruise. So I was pointing to and I was like, Michael, I can't go on. No. I was like finding excuses. He's like, oh, just cover it with makeup. Don't worry. Do it. So I do it. And my heart is absolutely pounding out of my chest. And I cringe when I see those early days of headlines. I'm like, oh, it's horrible. It's terrible back then. But my motto was just fake it till you make it. Just try to pretend you're confident, even though your heart's beating at 100 miles an hour. So eventually, I just started getting more comfortable. And then eventually Michael started, I'm still writing a lot. That was my main thing, was writing and researching, and especially exposing a lot of corruption in the church. And so Michael saw that I had a particular strength in doing the research, because that's my background is research.
Correct.
It's law. You have
Correct.
to be very meticulous in these things. So he saw
Yeah.
that I had a strength in that, and I could apply that to the investigations. So at
Mhm.
some point, he created the department called Special Projects. He made me head of that department. It's essentially the investigative reporting
Right.
arm of Church Militant. So that's how I ended up doing what I do.
Well, and I didn't realize that you had a law background,
Mhm.
until you told me about that. But now that you say it, it makes perfect sense because, as you say, in the legal world, you have to be very meticulous. You
Yes.
have to take responsibility for your evidence, and you have very strict rules in the courtroom and so on as to what counts as evidence. And so that brings us into our, the main thing that I wanted to get at, which is how do you choose your topics? You've interviewed, or not interviewed, that's not the right word. You've investigated numerous cases of clergy sex abuse. I'm assuming that the ones that make it on the air are a subset of the leads that come to you. And so let's start from the beginning. When a lead comes to you, well, first of all, how do leads come to you? How do you become aware that there might be a problem with Father X or Father Y or Father Z? How do you become aware of it in the first place? And then what do you do? How do you work from the beginning of that tip to, whatever happens next? But start at the beginning. How do you
Sure.
find out? Where do you get your leads?
We get our leads from multiple sources. We do have a tip line that people write to. So we get hundreds and hundreds of tips all the time. And if the people who are kind of looking at the tips, if they think this is something that would belong in my category investigation, they will forward it on to me. I'll get phone calls from friends or sources say, hey, I heard about this. We also have an action arm at churchmilitant.com website, email that's specifically reserved to whistleblowers, victims, and law enforcement. So sometimes we'll get tips that way. We get it by, multiple different ways. And like I said, we get hundreds. So obviously they have to go through a rigorous vetting process before anything appears on air. And so you start out with hundreds, right? And then they have to go through this sieve of vetting. And at the end of the day, you might come out with only like 2 or 3 or 4, because those are the only ones that you could actually vet, you could corroborate independently, because independent corroboration is crucial for any of this. We never go on rumors. We never go on hearsay. We never go on any evidence that wouldn't actually be also permitted in a court of law for evidence. So obviously, like eyewitness testimony, did you see it firsthand? Did you hear it? That's very important. Is there documentation? Can you show me a police report? Can you show me a lawsuit complaint? Can you show me a diocesan letter or correspondence? Can you show me anything objective that I can look at? Can you show me a letter from your abuser, admitting anything? Or did he send you love letters? Let me see those love letters, stuff like that. We have to have the hard evidence as well. And so really only by the time the whole process is over, you only get a handful of cases. That doesn't mean that the other tips are false. Not at all. In fact, I think many of the tips are actually true. And I will tell some of these people, look, I believe you. I believe that you're abused by this person. I just can't go to air with this because at this point, it's just he said, she said, and I have nothing else to go on. So.
Right. And we are not investigative journalists, right? And I'm very well aware that I am not in a position to do what you're doing, which is Ruth followers. This is why I have her on here, so you can see how this gets done. Because we will really only talk about cases when somebody authoritative has done some kind of vetting. So, we trust your sources. If somebody's admitted it, right? If somebody's been convicted, then we'll treat it like, okay, this is a done deal. The guy really did it. But the problem in all of these sexual cases of sexual harassment, whether they're criminal or just creepy, there's always an element of he said, she said, because of the nature of the act. It's private. It tends to be private. And so therefore getting corroboration is extremely important. So the part that you're doing here, the part that you're explaining to people, I want to just emphasize that, that you start off with 100 tips and you get maybe 2 or 3, so that are arable ultimately, right? And so it's the tip of the iceberg that you're seeing most likely. And so I want to say to people who have experienced some form of sexual harassment or sexual abuse, it's not that we don't believe you. It's that if we can't prove it, we're not going to sully somebody's reputation. We're not going to, we don't want to put our reputations on the line unless we can document it and prove it. But that doesn't mean that it didn't happen. So so tell people more about the kinds of evidence that you get, the kinds of interviews that you then conduct. Once it's gotten to this 2 to 3% situation, then you start talking to people and you interview people and stuff like that. Tell us a little bit about how that process goes.
Sure. And I'll just take an example from real life. It was my special report last year called Devil in Rome, probably the most disturbing special report I've ever done. And I'll be honest, when I first got the tip, I was very hesitant to go forward with this because the story just seemed so outrageous. It seemed so unbelievable, really, because you have to approach everything as a skeptic. Obviously, you want to believe, but at the same time, you have to vet, right? They say trust, but verify.
Right.
And so Rachel Mastrogiacomo came to me and told me essentially that she was abused in a satanic ritual abuse. And now I've heard about that before. I've heard about satanic ritual abuse. I'm always very cautious about that sort of thing. Right. Like I'm sure it goes on, but it's rare and there's no way to prove it, any of that. But in the case with Rachel, there was so much objective documentation in this case that it was just, it was a slam dunk. It was a slam dunk, which is why I went forward with this, even though I knew people would hit back and say, oh, that's so sensational. And how can that be? And no, and it's like, look at it. There are police reports. The man was criminally prosecuted and convicted for rape. And we have the admission of, I think it was the chancellor or vicar general, admitting himself in a testimony to the police that, yes, this happened. This priest, Father Jacob Bertrand, admitted this all to me. He desecrated the Eucharist in ritualistic abuse. I've got that on paper, for crying out loud. He's the vicar general of the diocese. And we also have the fact that Bishop McElroy, knowing of all this when he came in, reinstated him to ministry in a parish, putting no restrictions on him whatsoever and only removing him when the criminal charges came down. And then on top of that, we have the fact that the spokesman of the San Diego Diocese refused to defend Bishop McElroy when I wrote and questioned. That's a first for me. In the history of contacting dioceses and spokesmen for comment on their bishop's actions, every single one defends their bishop in some way or another. When I contacted the diocesan spokesman to ask about why did McElroy reinstate a priest who was accused of ritual abuse, including desecration of the Eucharist, of a woman that he was spiritually, why would he do that? And the answer from the spokesman, he didn't even try to defend it. He simply said, I really can't say. I mean, that was his response. I just can't say.
So hold on just a second, Christine, because I'm familiar with this case, and I think a lot of our followers will be too, because I interviewed Rachel some time ago, and my concern was with the way the laity did not understand her, did not support her, because I had another whole different aspect of the thing that concerned me.
Because she was an adult.
Yeah, right? but let me get the timeline right, because it's my understanding that that priest is now married. He's left the priesthood and he's now
laicized.
Married. So what was the timeline? When was Father Bertrand laicized and became just Mr. Bertrand?
When the allegations first came down, there was a previous bishop. That previous bishop suspended him, put him aside. And then Bishop McElroy comes in at the start of, I believe, was 2015.
Yes.
He learns about the allegations because, of course, he's downloaded on the status of his priests. He's told about what's, these horrible allegations against Bertrand. The fact that Bertrand admitted them. Okay. Mm-hmm. He admitted them. And McElroy puts him back in ministry until 2016, when criminal charges are brought down by the Minnesota prosecutor because the assault took place in Minnesota. Only then did McElroy remove him. And then after that, start the process of laicization once he was convicted. So he waited. Yeah.
I see. That's the time frame of the whole thing. Yeah. Yes. And I remember that it was Father Steve Callahan was the one whose testimony was, he was the vicar general at the time. Right. And he's the one who said, well, yeah, he admitted it in my office, and that was kind of a slam dunk piece of evidence right there.
Exactly. Yeah. And also, the fact when my report came out, McElroy was made aware of it. He has never denied the allegations. He's never even addressed them. So
yeah. Now, there's something about that case that you and I want to talk about as well that's a little bit different than we've mentioned so far. And that is what struck me about the case was, number one, of course, because she was an adult, people thought, well, she's partially complicit. Yada, 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 yada. And you know what? She will admit that. She will say, I was stupid. I shouldn't have, and so on and so forth, which is a very common thing amongst survivors, to go back and look at what was I thinking? Why did I let this go on? And that actually makes it more complicated for them personally. But the other thing about it was that I wanted people to hear from Rachel what the grooming process was like, because I think people don't really understand how a good girl, she was a very good girl, how you get sort of sucked into this, kind of, if I could use the term, vortex, of abuse, of misconduct, of your own, then self-doubt, because you did let yourself get involved in it, stuff like that. So the grooming part was one thing that I thought people should see and hear about. And the second thing was that he not only groomed her, he groomed the community, so that he had people in the community testifying on his behalf, her old friends testifying on his behalf, which is why she couldn't face going into the courtroom and staring him down and dealing with all of the blowback that she was going to get from people that she thought were her friends. And that is why he didn't go to prison. I mean, he didn't do jail time because
and he got probation. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And so I really wanted our people to see that, doggone it, you can holler all you want about the clergy, but here's a case where the behavior, the foolishness of the laity, if I could be so bold as to say that, the foolishness, the credulity of the laity led to this guy walking.
No, absolutely.
He admitted it.
Absolutely. And that's something that I try to bring out in the first part of the special report is because I foresaw that sort of backlash from people like, oh, how could, a young adult fall? She wasn't a child. She was a young adult. And how could she fall for this sort of thing? How could she be a victim? And I try to bring out that aspect in the first part of the special report. First of all, you have to understand her background. Her father died when she was young. She was absolutely devastated. She loved her. She was very close to her father. She looked up to him. He died from a young age. And from that point on, she turned to priests to take the place of her father. So she had this tremendous trust in priests, and she was blessed in her early life to be around trustworthy priests who helped guide her and lead her. She went to Steubenville. She got involved in the whole charismatic community. It was exposed to some good priests there as well. So she had no reason to doubt, the goodness of a priest. And Bertrand took full advantage of this. Something that's really interesting is there was, I can't remember exactly where, but someone was interviewing a pedophile who was convicted in prison. And the pedophile said, I can spot a vulnerable, weak target from a mile away. I just smell it. You give me three guys, three boys, whatever, walking down the street. I can pick out the one, that is vulnerable, and I will target that vulnerable one. Well, Rachel was clearly vulnerable. Bertrand is a predator. He could smell it. He could smell the fresh blood, and he went after it with a vengeance. And he took advantage of her.
Yeah. I want to corroborate that one point, because we had about a year ago, we did a very interesting interview with a detective who had investigated some 500 cases of childhood sexual abuse, crimes against children. That was his beat. And he investigated people, and he said exactly that, that the predators can figure out who the vulnerable parties are. You teach the kids good touch, bad touch, yada, 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 all this stuff is supposed to protect the kids. He said, we can get past that. That doesn't stop us at all. The thing they can't get past is attentive parents.
Right.
An attentive parent, they can't. So that's why the child of an unmarried parent or an absent father, that's why that girl is so vulnerable. That's why that's why the family breakdown leaves the children so vulnerable, because one parent's gone and the other one's probably preoccupied. So this is a very important theme throughout the Ruth Institute's work, is that the importance of marriage as a stabilizing force throughout, yet another area of social life, where having married parents really, really pays off. So this case, this what did you call it? The Devil in Rome? Is that what you called
Yes.
it? Yes, that was one of your more
recent spotlights. It was actually the special report that was aired last fall.
Yeah, recent and creepy, and disturbing, I guess would be the right word. Another thing that I have noticed that you guys are willing to do is to talk about any priest of any sort, from the left to the right, to if we shouldn't really use these kind of terms, but people use them so people know approximately what I'm talking about. No matter how traditionalist the person is, no matter how left-wing the person is, that's not what you guys are interested in. Tell us a little bit about that your thought process, Christine, and also what has that meant to you guys at Church Militant, that you take that kind of stand?
Well, I think we're all familiar with, at least when you look at secular media, the vast majority of the public has lost all confidence in secular media because they know that they're biased. They know that they will give favorable coverage to the people in their tribe, but then but then not say anything bad if they find out that people in their tribe have engaged in corruption, criminal behavior, and it's clear bias, which is why the vast majority of Americans have just lost all confidence in the media. There's bias. Well, I hate to say it, but the same thing exists in Catholic media among the people that you would least suspect. I'm not going to name any names, but I will just say that in my work, exposing clerical corruption on all sides of the spectrum, because I play no favorites. I don't care which tribe you belong to. If you have harmed a child or a victim or vulnerable, I don't care. You are going to be exposed and held accountable, period. Nobody should care whether you're conservative or liberal or trad or Novus Ordo. It doesn't matter. How does that matter when it comes to sex abuse and harming people? And in fact, the people who truly care about their so-called tribe, whatever it might be, if you truly care about that, then you would want the filth to be purged from its ranks. So that's why, I'll be honest with you, when I started covering SSPX, sex abuse, before that time, I had focused only on bishops and clergy in the Novus Ordo Church. There's plenty of,
hold on, just pause for one moment, because we have a lot of non-Catholic followers. So let's spell this out. SSPX is the Society of Pius X, which is a very traditionalist order, which has, shall we say, uncertain canonical status. They're at the far traditionalist end of the spectrum. Then Novus Ordo is the term used for the post-Vatican II Mass. And that's by far the most common form of the Roman Rite that one would see, and so that covers a lot of people. You can have people who are traditionalist within that. You can have people who are way off on the on the left wing end of things. But what Christine is saying is, within that spectrum, she didn't care. Did he do it? All we want to know is, did he do it? That's the only thing that matters. That's my position too.
And with the Society of St. Pius X, which we shortened to SSPX, like you mentioned, they're traditional. They will only offer the Latin Mass, the traditional Vatican sacraments, all of that. So very traditional, known to be orthodox, known to be conservative. And so you would expect a group like that, which holds itself forth to be very pious and very devout, unlike some of the more liberal, pro-leftist clergy in the rest of the in some of the parts of the church. You would not expect this sort of sex abuse and cover-up to take place in the trad circles. And unfortunately, there was quite a lot going on in the SSPX, and it wasn't just a couple of bad apples here or there. The corruption was all up to the very top. I'm talking Bishop Fillet, Superior General, which is like the head honcho of the entire organization, was actively protecting, shuffling, transferring, promoting predators who would then go on to abuse children again. And I have incontrovertible evidence of this happening in case after case after case after case. And when I started exposing this in April 2020, I have to be honest with you, the viciousness of the backlash I got knocked me off of my feet for a while. I was not expecting that, because I had done the same exact thing with other clergy. And you get the objections here and there, but none of it even approached the viciousness that I got from adherents of the SSPX who absolutely refused to believe that their clergy could be guilty of any of that. So of course they attacked the messenger. They attack the victims, they attack the whistleblower, do anything to smear them and discredit them rather than question their leader. And it's gotten slowly better over the years because I think I've just done so much exposing of this, and I just keep doing it no matter what the backlash is, because I keep finding more things and more victims come to me, that at this point people have become somewhat resigned to that this is happening. It's
got to be happening.
They still hate me. They don't like that but at least they're coming to realize, okay, this is happening. So how do we deal with this?
Right. And this episode is comparable to the more recent episode of former Father Frank Pavone, who has been laicized by Rome for reasons having nothing to do with sexual harassment, as far as, at least officially on paper. They had other reasons for laicizing him, but numerous accounts have come forward now of people, of young women who were sexually harassed by him over the years. And again, these seem to be pretty well corroborated things where people made reports years ago, and it's on paper, and there's multiple witnesses all pointing in the same direction. And yet within the pro-life community, there is a tendency to circle the wagons to protect Father Frank. He's being picked on. Why are people stirring this up? All this type of thing. And so I think it would be a good thing, Christine, for you and I to just kind of explore a little bit. What do you think is the psychology that says let's protect the wagons? Is there it's like there's a sound instinct that's gone really astray, that's gotten really twisted somehow. What's your thought about, these are different instances of the same thing,
right?
Yeah,
correct. I think the problem, at least in the case of Father Frank Pavone, former Father Frank Pavone, is he's been a very, very public figure for a long time. So, millions of people know who he is as solid Orthodox pro-life, all of that. The problem is that people have developed a cult of personality around him, right? So an attachment to him and sort of idealizing and putting him on a platform such that they don't see, they cannot possibly entertain that this person that they kind of idolize and admire could possibly be capable of this behavior. It doesn't matter how much evidence you put in their faces. It's like, no, they're psychologically, I just cannot. It's a cult of personality, really. And let me just reiterate for the audience out there, if they may not be familiar with all the evidence put forth, it's not just allegations from a few women. I spoke to two priests, very well-known, respected priests. One of them, Father Stephen Imbarato. The other one, I'm not allowed to give his name, but if I gave his name, everybody would know who he is. Both priests worked closely with Father Pavone, and both confirmed independently that they witnessed the sexual harassment and that they counseled women who came to them about the sexual harassment seeking help. In the case of Father Imbarato, he actually resigned from Priests for Life after demanding that they implement an independent sexual harassment committee to protect these women. And it was only after they promised to do that that he left. And so as far as I know, I think they implemented it. I don't know because he hasn't really been in touch with them. But and then you've got, like you mentioned, the documentation from two separate dioceses, the Archdiocese of New York, then the Diocese of Amarillo, Texas, sex abuse reports going back, and now we know that Father Pavone was required to attend sexual harassment courses. So there's just, and he himself has never denied it. He himself has never denied it. He issued some quasi apology. But so the evidence at this point is just, it's overwhelming. Nobody can deny it. If you're objective, you can't. But the fact is, too many people are not objective. They still want to cling to this idea of who he is.
Yes. And so the first line of defense is to say it didn't really happen. Well, now that you know that it happened, the next thing that I'm hearing, on Facebook and in comment boxes and things like that, where I'm chiming in or I'm looking over people's shoulders or whatever, the next thing you're hearing people say is, well, these things that Father Pavone did are not really all that serious. And to which then, my reply is, I get it that it was not a crime, and nobody's saying that it's a crime. Okay, I get it. But think about if your 20-year-old daughter went to work for a major pro-life group and came home and said, Daddy, the priest is hitting on me, get me out of here, which is, I think, essentially what one of the girls ended up doing, get me out of here. How would you feel? We should be able to send our girls to work at pro-life organizations and send our sons to seminaries without worrying about priests hitting on them, no matter how old they are. We should be able to do that,
Of course.
Right?
Of course. And if any boss in a secular corporation acted that way, oh my gosh, he could easily be slapped with a sexual harassment complaint. Right. He'd get in massive trouble. But for whatever reason, we give priests a pass. Right. I mean, people may not be familiar with some of these allegations. First of all, at least 4 women now have come forward, at least. Yes. There may be more at this point, but at least 4. And I mean, I'm talking like giving a married woman a kiss on the cheek 8 times a day, texting her at all hours of the day and night, to the point where the husband had to, write to Father and say, stop texting my wife. I mean, that sort of thing. Right. And I just lost my train of thought. But yeah, it's just, it drives me nuts when people try to dismiss the allegations. First of all, nobody's saying that he abused anyone. Nobody's saying that. But this is still sexual harassment. It's totally inappropriate for a priest. Right. And nobody should put up with this.
Right. And I tracked also what he said when he responded to the allegations when they first came out in the Pillar. And he basically said, if I offended anybody, I'm sorry. And I'm like, you know what, this is not, for a fact, whether you put your hand on a girl's thigh while she was driving you to the airport, whether you did that or not. And most normal human beings, most normal men can go through their whole life without ever doing that even a single time. So don't give me this, if this bothered you, stuff. Yeah. Right. If exactly. No, you should have known that you shouldn't be doing that. So he never denied it, and he never apologized. And that's where I'd like to go next, if we may, Christine, because if we think about this from the perspective of the victim, I've interacted with victims who have had some measure of justice and some who have had none, right? And when somebody admits something, that's a huge relief for the victim. And if they do time, if they're arrested, if there's anything like that, that's a huge relief for them. If people believe them, it's huge. And so what do you think, in your interaction with victims, what do you think they want? What would help them?
Right. Very quickly, just before I addressed your question, because now I remember what I was going to say.
Okay, sure.
If the actual sexual harassment allegations don't bother people, they should, at a minimum, be bothered by the fact that donor money to Priests for Life was to compensate victims where that was set up. Victims who were upset decided to leave, and they were actually compensated using donor money from Priests for Life as essentially hush money to keep them quiet. That's been documented now in 2 separate cases. So that should bother people. Donor money shouldn't go to that, but that's that. Okay, so coming back to your question about what victims want.
What do they want? Because sometimes people are like, oh, they're just in it for the money. And, maybe someone is, but I've never encountered anybody like that, right? No. So what do you think they want?
Yeah. In my work with victims, the main thing I find that victims want is they just want to be heard. They want to be heard, and they want to be believed, because many of them come to me having been dismissed by church authorities, having gone to the diocese, gone to trusted authorities, and basically been told, well, I don't believe you, or no, this couldn't have happened. Or I mean, it just re-victimizes them. And they just want to be heard. They want to be seen. They want to be believed. And so that's what they need. And it's incredibly healing. People have written me, victims or the family members of victims afterwards have written me after I've aired a story. And I always try to do it in a very respectful way. And sometimes they're in tears, and they just say, I can't thank you enough. I can't thank you enough for airing this. This has brought so much healing to me, to my family, because this is really the first time anyone has listened to my story and presented and given me a platform for people to hear me. And so it is very healing for these victims. And then a lot of them they want justice too. They have the right to demand justice, because in most of the cases, there has not been justice for them. So, yeah.
Yes. And also, if we compare this to like a dysfunctional family, okay, so the Catholic Church is a worldwide organization of over 1 billion members. Of course, there are going to be pockets of dysfunction in a family of this size. There are going to be things going on that shouldn't be going on. So if you think about just an ordinary family, you've got your family there, and Uncle Harry's an alcoholic, but no one will say it, right? The family has a protocol, you could say, or a way of managing it, of getting along with it, of sort of dealing with it without causing too much upset, right? Because Harry, Uncle Harry is he's volatile, and you're walking on eggshells all the time, but you know what you're supposed to do, you know how you're supposed to manage. So the person who says, you know what, everybody, Uncle Harry is an alcoholic, and we should really do something about it, that person becomes the problem.
No, that is exactly right. And I think that's a perfect analogy. It's the elephant in the living room.
Right.
Everyone has learned to manage it, but it's dysfunctional.
Yes.
And then the one brave whistleblower who's willing to stand up and say, look, here's a problem. We have to address it.
Right.
People have grown comfortable in their ways and their silence and all of that. And they don't want to get out of that comfort zone, because they know it's going to mean a lot of pain, ripping off the Band-Aid, and letting, but as I always say, sunlight is the best disinfectant. You've got to shine a light on all this stuff. And it is hard. It's painful. You're going to go through a lot of hell, but it's worth it to purge the church of this evil.
Because on the other side of that pain is some healing for everybody. And it's not unusual for there to be, one branch of the family where people can talk about it openly, and it's like, and those family members hang out together and so on, and there's still bitterness on the part of the others and so on. And it often happens that you can't get past that. You can only go so far.
Right.
But I do think that an apology from a perpetrator goes a long, long way. If there's actual healing, if there's actual repentance, that's the word I'm looking for. If a person is actually repentant, that's huge. I mean, that's huge. I mean, I've had all kind of crazy stuff happen in my life, and I've seen perpetrators who go to their grave thinking that they were the victims, right? And that's a wound. That's a wound that never fully heals in the family. You can get past it, but not really. And then I've seen cases where somebody said, "I'm so sorry for what I put you guys through." Oh my gosh, that's huge. I mean, that just makes so much of a difference. And I look at somebody like Father Frank Pavone, former Father Frank Pavone, and so many people looked up to him and still look up to him. And it's like the pro-life movement is like a family. And many of the people in the family are in agony over this man, because they trusted him and they believed in him, and they want to believe in him, and they want to protect him. And if he would just say, I did it, and I'm sorry, I was wrong, it would just, it would take so much of a burden off of so many people if he would do that, and if he could admit absolutely everything and he wouldn't go to jail. There's nothing here that's criminal, I don't think, as far as I know. I don't know, maybe you know otherwise, but it would mean so much to so many people for somebody to be authentically sorry.
That would be the ideal. The ideal would be for the perpetrator to genuinely apologize to those he harmed. That would be the ideal, but unfortunately it's extremely rare. Why? Because it requires humility. It requires contrition. And in too many of the cases that I've worked with, both are lacking. There's not the humility, there's not the contrition. It's all about protecting myself, protecting the institution, protecting the so-called, the church. And too many bishops have that attitude, is I've got to protect because I don't want to be sued. And so an admission, saying sorry is essentially admission of guilt, which then they can use against you in a lawsuit. So absolutely an apology would be ideal, but unfortunately that rarely ever happens.
But and in some cases you got people who are full on pathological people, who are not capable of apologizing. I think, I think there's some that are truly sick people, what's the word, sociopaths, right? They really don't care that they're hurting other people. And then I think there are people who are fearful in all the ways that you're describing, which is, obviously not good, not healthy, but it's not full on incapable of it. But when we think as Catholics, when we think about our theology and our what would you call it, our culture about admissions of guilt and so on and so forth, I mean, Catholicism has the resources to deal with this, because we know, everybody knows or should know, that being really sorry is really hard. I mean, there's a reason Protestants don't want to go into the confessional and say it out loud to a human being. I mean, it's just too hard. And I think, Christine, we're all protective to a certain extent. Everybody wants to protect their good image of themselves, even if it's around little things. We want to.
Yeah.
I mean, the guilty conscience is really a problem. It's really a problem. And the confessional gives us the opportunity to deal with it. And it's a miracle. Every truly contrite person is miraculous in a certain way, because naturally speaking, no one wants to do it.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah. Confession is such a great grace, such a great gift. And, I was outside the church for a long time as a Protestant. Of course, Protestants don't have that. They don't believe in it. They think that's just enough to confess to God and you're forgiven. The problem with that is it's very easy to stay mired in sin, habitual sin, because you're, I mean, it's just me and God, and I'm sorry, God, but there's no real accountability necessarily, unless you have some person that you're going to but there's not. And I remember when I came back to the faith, with the sacrament of penance, I mean, my goodness, it was so effective to eliminate this habitual sin. For one, the graces that come, just the supernatural graces that come from it, but also just the human aversion to wanting to going to a priest and confessing embarrassing sins. I mean, it's humiliating, so maybe that's just my pride. I don't like to have to do that, especially if it's the same thing over and over and over again. So I noticed it was extremely effective for me in eliminating a lot of the habitual sin that I'd been mired in as a Protestant. So it's a great grace. And if these perpetrators or these bishops who are covering up crimes, if they only understood that a genuine contrition, confession, and then apologizing would relieve them of this massive burden that's weighing on them. Mm-hmm. If only they would understand that and do that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I can relate to what you're saying. I was a lapsed Catholic for 12 years, and I lived like I was an atheist. I never said I don't believe in God. I never really went there, but I acted like I didn't believe in God, and I can remember my first confession after 12 years was such a relief. And then over time, I confessed more and more and more things. And really the final step for me, the last thing to let go of, was contraception, because I didn't really think it was wrong. And it took several years of, being back in the church when I finally was able to authentically say, I was wrong to do this and the church was right, And I Christine, I'll never forget it. The night I confessed it, the priest by then, I think, knew who I was, even though it was, was not face to face or anything. But he goes, good. It's a sort of peaceful sound on the other side. I went out of that confessional. I skipped across the parking lot. I was so relieved. So anyway, there's a piece to it, and I feel like since 2018, when the whole McCarrick thing came out, that there have been a lot of discussions about clergy sex abuse that I don't think took place after 2002. I mean, I think for whatever reason, the church is in a different place and we're more willing to talk about it. And so I think there are some things culturally happening that are constructive. That's my opinion.
I think you're right. I think you're right, because back in 2002, when the whole, Boston Globe spotlight broke open the whole sex abuse scandal in Boston, then it became nationwide and everyone started to learn about the massive sex abuse scandal in the church in America. That was really the first time that the American church had to face its day of reckoning with regard to clergy sex abuse. And the bishops got together and they put together the Dallas Charter, and they assured us that, this is never going to happen. We're going to be very strict, zero tolerance. And of course, McCarrick had a hand in drafting that policy. 2018, at that point, when the whole McCarrick scandal broke open, laity who had once believed bishops, kind of who are part of, I guess you would call the Church of Nice, which is the phrase that Michael Voris coined.
Right.
That's kind of when they became red pilled. They opened their eyes and were like, wow, we believed the bishops back then. We believed that this was going to end. Right. And now it's just as bad as before. And one of the architects of the Dallas Charter actually turned out to be America's most notorious clerical predator.
They had to have known it.
And yes, and there was a complicit circle of clergy who protected him at the highest levels. That's what was so shocking to everyone. Now, it wasn't shocking to us at Church Militant. because we kind of knew this. We've been calling out McCarrick and Wuerl and Archbishop Gregory and various other people who are complicit in all this for years. And nobody believed us. They were attacking us, saying, how can you go after these good, high-ranking cardinals who've done nothing but good for the church? How could you do this? Why are you so focused on homosexual infiltration of the clergy? What's wrong? Conspiracy theories. And it was funny how in 2018, we got so many messages from people apologizing. I was wrong about you. I was wrong. I thought you guys were tinfoil hat conspiracy theorists and obsessed. And people apologized to us.
Well, so there's that whole aspect that you just described. But also, I have a sense that there are more people like church secretaries and seminarians willing to say something now. And that partly happens because there are more laity who are going to believe them. So you can find somebody who will listen now. It won't be everybody, it won't be as many people as it should be, and so on and so forth, but somebody's going to listen. And so that makes it, I think, much easier for more constructive things to take place.
It is easier. People are still afraid, though. I find people are still very, very afraid. And it can be a little bit frustrating, to be honest, because we're all familiar with Project Veritas. The way that they're able to do their work is because you have whistleblowers willing to come forward and say, look, I was part of this. All this stuff happened, whether it's at Google or Facebook or CNN or NBC, or whatever. And they're willing to talk. But I find that when you're dealing with people in the church, they are far less willing to. There's still a lot of fear that reigns in dioceses and chanceries, and people afraid to lose their job. And I would just encourage people to get in touch with me. Because I will be very respectful. I'll protect your confidentiality. You can write to me at actionarm@churchmilitant.com. I would just encourage them, because as you just said, more laity are willing to listen to you now than ever in the history of this nation.
Right. And, but I think one thing that's hard for Catholics today, for a number of reasons, not just clergy sex abuse, but a lot of the things that are going on in Rome and so on, that people are like, what is happening to our church? And my bishop, God bless him, when I first came here to Lake Charles, he said something to me that has been very helpful to me in dealing with, some of the Pope Francis craziness and stuff like, he basically said, what we have to stick with is the catechism. And I think that's really true. Put not your faith in princes, people. People are going to let you down. That's going to happen. But the doctrine, the catechism, the faith, especially the faith around marriage and family and human sexuality, that is good and life-giving and humane and true. And you can put your faith in that. And so that means you can't put your faith in people all the time. They're going to let you down sometimes. But stick with the doctrine, have your faith in that, put your faith in that, because that's what Jesus expects us to preserve. Jesus doesn't expect us to overlook every sin of everybody else. He doesn't expect us to do that, but he does expect us to hand down the doctrine and hand down the deposit of the faith to the next generation. That's what he expects of us.
100%. I completely agree with you. And we do get letters from people despairing over the state of the church, frustrated at Pope Francis, at this bishop or that bishop. And my advice to them is popes come and go. The church always remains.
That's right.
Popes come and go. The church always remains. Trust in Christ. Christ promised that the gates of hell shall not prevail against his church, even if that means that there's only a little remnant that he sets aside to preserve his church. But that's a promise of his. And he does not lie. Our Lord doesn't lie. And my advice is be part of that remnant, be part of that faithful remnant, pass on the faith, the integrity of the faith to others and those around you. And sometimes, on social media, I can see people obsessing over the Pope, over his latest gaffe or whatever, and they're in despair and you're constantly tweeting about it. And I'm just like, okay, I understand the frustration. I get it. Believe me, I get the frustration. But at this point, this obsession with the Pope is not helping your soul. And how is it helping to save other souls? I mean, what are you personally doing in your own sphere with your family, friends, coworkers, whoever, to pass on the faith? I mean, are you spending all your time focusing on all the scandals and everything like that? Or are you actually passing on the faith to people around who need to hear it?
Right.
This is much more healthy to focus on.
Well, Christine, that is a great place to end our interview, because I agree with you 100%. And I think most of the Ruth Institute followers agree with that. That's why they follow us. They follow us to be better informed about the church's teaching on marriage, family, and human sexuality. And that includes many people who aren't Catholic, right? And so I don't want to spend too much time on scandalous things, because I don't want to scandalize our non-Catholic brothers and sisters who are following us, but they have problems too, right? They have their problems too. And the reality is that our Lord put you and me in this time, in this place, to deal with these problems. So no complaining, no whining. Let's get on with it. This is what our Lord expects of us today. Christina,
Amen.
Thank you so much for being my guest on today's episode of the Dr. J Show.
Thank you so much, Dr. Morse. And thank you so much for the wonderful work of the Ruth Institute. You've been one of the few places that have courageously put forth the truth. So thank you so much for your work as well.